thank you for attending our third and last lunchtime lecture of the fall semester. Please stay tuned for an announcement of the surprising lecture series we are preparing for the spring of 2022. Today is Wednesday, November 10th, 2021. I'm Jaime Correa. I'm the new director of the undergraduate program, and I'm also an associate professor in practice at the School of Architecture. This semester, I'm the faculty in residence, our Rome program, where it's now 6 p.m. I want to take this opportunity to thank Raymond San Cristobal for the technical support and his work behind the scenes. As you know, our School of Architecture has a robust lecture series that includes the Technoglass lecture series on Wednesdays under the coordination of Professor Joe Lamere. And we also have what our dean calls the Currents lecture series, which is typically on Monday evenings or as needed. And this is our Lunchtime lecture series, which this semester highlighted in 3 different sessions the published work and scholarship of 5 of our faculty members. Today, I'm pleased to present one of my colleagues and my office neighbor in Building 49, Eric Firley. Eric is an associate professor at the School of Architecture of the University of Miami and the coordinator of the second-year housing studio in the undergraduate program. He was born in Germany and studied economics, architecture, and city design in Freiburg, Lausanne, Weimar, and London. Eric is the founder and co-author of the Wiley's Urban Handbook series, which consists so far of 3 reference books in the fields of housing, high-rise, urbanism, and master planning. Nevertheless, Eric is going to talk today about his new book, Designing Change, Professional Mutations in Urban Design 1980-2020. This book can be purchased at the University of Miami bookstore, at the School of Architecture, at Amazon, and other digital venues. Again, the book is titled Designing Change, Professional Mutations in Urban Design 1980-2020. Please welcome Eric Firley and let us get inspired by his provocative conversations with urban designers all over the world and by his enormous taxonomic work on housing, high rises, and master planning. Thank you very much for joining us. Eric.
Thank you, Jaime. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining me during your lunch break. It's probably the nicest day since April, so I really appreciate that you're sitting here with me. I would like to thank particularly Jaime Correa for setting up this series about faculty publications. It's something that we wanted to do for a long time, but now it became reality and also finds a certain audience. I even have the impression that Jaime is actually reading the books, and this is particularly valuable. I also would like to thank the Dean for making it possible and putting it on the schedule. And before I forget it, at the end of the presentation, please send me an email in case you would like to purchase the book. The Dean, who had bought a certain amount of copies in the name of the school in preparation of an event that due to COVID could not yet take place, agrees to sell it for $35 instead of $50. I think for over 500 pages and hundreds of illustrations, that might be a reasonable cost. More importantly, let me talk for a couple of minutes about the background of this project. A comment that I received a couple of times suggested that it would be more valuable to write about urban design rather than to talk about it with other urban designers. They wanted to know what my own recommendations were. And certainly this is something that I initially envisioned. I could have sat down and conceived some kind of primer of how to do urban design in the 21st century. There are a couple of reasons why I eventually decided against this option. The main one really pertains to the differentiation between the what and the how, the process, and the fact that they are equally important and complementary. The what, if it can be summarized shortly, describes in the case of urban design, the design principles and features that are most appropriate to address the urban environmental challenges of the future. In today's terms, marked by the preparation for the increasing effects of climate change, this often translates into the incorporation of relief zones for flooding caused by heavy rainfalls, the addition of greenery for the prevention of the heat island effect, or the adaptation of coastal areas to sea level rise, to just mention a few. All of this is very interesting and represents the bulk of what we teach at this school on an everyday basis, particularly in the studios. In terms of design, it is relatively straightforward. I would like to share in this context this slide presented last year by Jeffrey Raven from the New York Institute of Technology to my seminar students. It summarizes quite neatly the type of urban design work that currently is developed all around the world. So, I think I chose this slide, as I said, from this presentation that my students received. I think it really summarizes quite well, this kind of scenario making in urban design between an existing situation of an area in New York and a highly densified version, from 17,000 to 65,000 inhabitants, provision for 2050, and a translation of this densification according to business as usual rules, as we can see here in the middle, essentially using the kind of urban design that we would use until today. And then the best practice scenario that we see here on the bottom, and obviously we're using some kind of computation in order to calculate the carbon footprint, and obviously trying to bring it down as much as possible, and at the same time also to limit the urban heat island effect. Even after adding this slide and, kind of claiming that this would be an example of what we could do in terms of design, very quickly we get to questions of the process as well. Because, the longer you think about it, the more you will ask yourself the question, how you can actually implement this kind of urban design that we can see on the bottom. If we have a zoning that currently would allow only for what happens in the middle. So obviously it would be much easier to implement this if we have a very strong public sector, or if we have single ownership of the whole land in order to translate this. But if we have, small scale ownership and a weak public sector, you would probably not like to be the person who here now has to provide just a green lawn rather than developing a 10-story tall building. So this again is actually also an example of how the what and the how connect. However, one too often realizes that these straightforward proposals are not being implemented. We can design the nicest master plans and street sections, but this is of little value if we do not know how to carry them into society. And this issue is, by the way, more pronounced in urban design and planning than in architecture, due to the different scale and user-client relationship. Who is actually the client? What is the program? What is the final goal of the whole project? For an urban project, none of these questions can be answered in a simple way. All of them require a certain political, social, and eventually philosophical positioning. Most importantly, they are also expressions of individual opinion. Not everybody will agree. This last point touches me particularly because it seems to epitomize a tension in the current society between an almost blind trust in technology, usually linked to very specific financial interest, that could also be described as a new type of technocracy on the one hand, and an increasing desire for participation and co-determination by the population on the other hand. We should not be fooled into the idea that specific technologies will be able to solve any major societal issue. This could, if at all, only be the case if everybody had the same opinion and attitude, an idea that contradicts the notion of freedom that seems to be so dear to most of us. We hence have to juggle with a complex and constantly mutating construct that, as an urban scene, defines our ability to debate and form consensus, mostly through the spatial creation of social exchange. and at the same time implements innovative solutions for the improvement of our living conditions, based on the consensus that has been found. The mutual interdependence of this situation intrigues me and drives my work. Two, or I think now three examples that I think highlight these issues quite well are following. So this is not content of the book. I just wanted to come back to this question of the how and the what, the product and the process. So you probably have heard about this. This is just one of the latest articles about what happens on the waterfront in Toronto. Years ago, the CEO of Google and I think the Prime Minister, not only the mayor of Toronto, but the Prime Minister of Canada had signed an agreement to build a new district, as they coined it, from the internet up. And then very quickly, a lot of opposition formed. And, one realized that through unclear reasons, politicians and corporations here have been somehow forced into an agreement that was not really cooked out, which seemed really to be some kind of a marketing gag, and threatened to use future citizens and the population as some kind of guinea pig for new technologies that would be tested by Google. And don't get me wrong, a lot of that is certainly the future, and a lot of that is very inspiring, but it's sometimes scary to see, how quickly one can take decisions and then afterwards have to come back. And it's certainly not a compliment for us, the School of Architecture and the whole profession of architects and urban designers, to realize that the city decided to essentially completely change the project of city making in signing a contract with a corporation that has essentially nothing to do with any kind of urban development. So I think this is, a kind of negative but interesting example. Another example is one that some of you know through your own research or through presentations that I've previously done. This is a book that I just found on the internet. This is a new one about the outcome of co-housing, and I find that it's a more straightforward example of what I mean between this relationship between the process and the product, because it's really built on the idea that if you give the ability to a new user group to develop themselves, that the architectural outcome would also be a different one. So it's not just the idea of participation for the sake of participation, or maybe for affordability, but it's the idea that we could design something differently if other actors are given the chance to have their say. So we can see, as a closer look, we can see here that some decisions are taken here that a normal developer might not have been taken. And this is really something that, has become quite important also in regards to climate change. One of the early examples in Germany that were part of ecological urbanism took place in a place called Vauban, which is part of the city of Freiburg in southern Germany. This started already in the 90s. And the aim was actually to provide the most performing ecological architecture and urbanism that essentially the world had seen. And rather than just to force developers to develop with more energy efficiency, they had the idea to sell small lots to individuals or groups of individuals who had just decided to put the means and the time in order to develop something that could be perform much better than what a developer would be willing and able to invest in those building technologies, simply because the developer could not know if anybody would be willing to pay back. So I could talk a long time about this, but this is not the aim. Last example, and I will make this even shorter. I have been involved in research about modular architecture, and I see many opportunities. We saw news in the University of Miami newsletter this week, also about 3D printing and the availability of possibilities for affordable housing, which are truly exciting. Having said that, I think everybody has to somehow put it a little bit in perspective. The idea about how to build cheaper exists for a long time. The problem is how to have availability of land and how to change a certain economic logic that makes it very difficult to provide affordable housing. We have seen this happening in Miami now for many years. Land there is enough, but the idea obviously is not to sell it cheaply, but for the highest possible price. You know, that's the logic that has something to do with process and political issues. And we have to be excited about the technology behind it, but it will essentially not solve the actual problem. But we will talk about this a little bit more. So what I tried in this book is to better understand how this type of relationship between the what and the how has changed over the last decades, how it has impregnated the workings of the urban design profession, and to what extent this allows us to make predictions about the future. This could not have been done just by myself, not only because I do not practice anymore, but because I cannot on my own represent a pluralism of opinions. The aim was to give some of the world's most experienced and respected professionals in city making the opportunity to look back on their work, freed from the everyday pressures of time and money. With this background in mind, each of the 12 participants has been invited to pick a specific topic that we developed together during several long sessions, accompanied by a selection of 3 projects that act as materializations of the spoken content. What I would like to do in this presentation is to bring these voices somehow in relationship to each other. A fake one, obviously, as all interviews have been undertaken separately. It is important to understand that this cannot be a summary of what we discussed in the book. The interviews have already been heavily edited and shortened, and I believe that cutting them further down would damage their integrity. By the way, we had also the discussion, you know, how would we do this today? I remember I tried to get a provost award to finance this project, and one of the comments for not getting it was, why don't you do it with Skype? This was before COVID. Probably I would have gotten more of these comments, only that it wouldn't be Skype, but probably Zoom. I think the answer would have been from my side is, I wouldn't have found the joy of doing that. I think that's one of the things that we have found out over the last almost 2 years, is that we can do almost everything online and sometimes even better, but we have to want it. And I certainly wouldn't have done this project if it had not been involved with actually meeting these people and having interesting discussions and sometimes fun. This might be, by the way, the right moment to thank all the participants again for their time and contribution. I feel truly honored to have been given this opportunity. But what I would like to test for the first time is to let these voices speak and interact differently according to the audience's choices. So this could be online or the people in Glasgow Hall. Let's see what narrative we create together. So who would like to start? Who intrigues you? This presentation has no chronology, so you have to help me. I don't know where to start. Anybody would like to have more information about one person? Winnie Maas. Okay, good choice. Probably one of the most best known of the people in this book. He's one of the founders of MVRDV. It's an architectural company, but also an urban design company. I've forgotten the figures, but they actually have a big share of their revenues coming from urban design. And Winnie Maas is the person heading this department. So the chapter in this book was called Mission Impossible, because what I found interesting about MVRDV is their ability to make urban design to a certain extent sexy. You know, I think one of the reasons that urban design tends to be maybe less attractive to many students and to professionals than architecture, I think it's because it tends to be less conceptual, more rationalistic. And MVRDV somehow was able to conceive many highly interesting proposals that at the same time have this kind of conceptual clarity and the spectacular notion that we often find in architecture or the architecture that is being published. For this event today, I chose 2 subtopics of this longer discussion. One has to do with the background of what we are doing today. What is it that MVRDV is trying to achieve in their proposals? And another one has to do with small scale development. So maybe partly connecting to the kind of co-housing issues that I mentioned previously. So I might just read this, I think that's the idea of the citations. This is one of the longer ones, so bear with me. I believe that there are two major phases of modernity to look back upon and to analyze from our current situation. The first one is the hardcore one, with projects such as Toulouse-Le Mirail, Amsterdam Bijlmer, or Leninstadt. Also just, take, for example, some of the big projects of social housing that you know from Chicago or whatever other city, less from Miami. To start with, these were some very sincere and good ideas of how to separate cars from pedestrian and bicycle movements. But in reality, it has led to unsafe environments without social control and linkages. Everything looks the same in this kind of environment and becomes monstrous without any space for individualism. And then there was this interesting moment of the humanistic modernists with people like Lucien Kroll. He made this kind of colonizing housing in Belgium, in Louvain-la-Neuve, which is a fantastic project. But taste-wise, people hate it today. Why? Because it looks very cheap, and therefore nobody considers it as exemplary. Today we have more materials and colors to choose from than ever, and a different taste. There is a learning curve from the first phase to Lucien Kroll, and from him to now. We are in a position to benefit from these two phases, to learn how to create our future environments. We mix traffic again, we have invented soft spaces and shared spaces. It took us 50 years to blend again. So I love modernity because of its wider thinking and ambition. And yes, I see the disadvantages of it. And I think that our contemporary technological means can help us to better control the complexity, to solve some of the sociological issues. The whole pixel movement, as I call it, which goes back to the 60s and 70s, inspired by structuralist ideas and turning around the use of modules, can now be rethought. And advances in computation, mechanical and drawing systems allow us to get rid of the symmetry and rigidity that Hermann Herzberger and Team X had to stick to. So I think this also has something to do with, what is our society looking after at this moment? I think part of this answer seems to me that, we had, postmodernism, we had more recent philosophical developments, but this question of what is kind of the new vision of the future, what are our ideals to pursue, seem really not have really to been superposed by anything else than the ambitious proposals of modernity. And I think that's where, somehow Winnie Maas tries to connect to and maybe see how our also technological development makes it possible to, get rid of some of the problems that existed previously. So this is one of the projects, I think this Pixel project mentioned, built by Hermann Herzberger, I think in the outskirts of Amsterdam. So the idea is, how could we take those fantastic, proposals, but maybe make them more contemporary, take away some of the gray, almost literally, take away some of the repetition that probably is also there because it just made it cheaper at that time. And here just, we are not going too much into the proposals, but this is an early project, I think, Ypenburg by MVRDV. It's one that during my studies was heavily published. You can see that they actually, in a kind of a provocative way, took the whole development area and block by block came with a very different proposal, making it very, each has a different typology, each has a different color. So there's this idea of adding an element of pluralism that was definitely not the idea of modernism. But, even the first glance here shows us that in terms of urban grain, there are also ideas of modernity that have actually been incorporated. So this was one of the topics that I found interesting. Another one here, much shorter, has to do with, again, I think modernism and its ambition and size of intervention. So what he says is, from the smallest beautiful movement, I definitely dissociate myself, because I do think that large-scale urbanism still makes sense and that it is needed to develop a collective, whatever that collective might be. To fully decentralize power and decision-making is problematic because it can also lead to inefficiency. In the Netherlands, I already feel that there is less interest and pressure to approach infrastructure and water issues on a national level than 15 years ago. So I'm a little bit wary of this tendency. So I think I don't have to repeat a lot. It's discussions also that I think we have in terms of how to fight climate change. If we become too small scale, there are many issues that, like the zoning issue can actually only be solved with the help of the public sector and the collaboration of the whole society. If we only build on, what individuals can do on their own or in collaboration with friends and family, we'll not be able to get very far, at least according to Winnie Maas. Who else? Orbanus. So yeah, this is actually, the selection, we tried to make it a little bit global, essentially somehow, had to stick to Europe, predominantly the US and China. So Luke Xiaodu here and Wang Hui represent the team of Orbanus, who are based in Shenzhen and in Beijing. And what we spoke about mostly was the fact that China, might follow to a certain extent a very pragmatic development, very economic-driven development at the moment. But the growth rates and also the population growth rates in some cities is so enormous and spectacular that China also becomes a place where what could be considered in the US or in Europe as a utopia, actually in China could be like a pragmatic solution for the future. So we were discussing proposals for hyperdensity and these kind of issues and the social implications of these kinds of proposals. What I would like to talk about, in this presentation, however, again, are, the definition of urban design from the point of view, from the Chinese point of view, and also, what it means actually to do urban design as somebody who must be now in his mid-50s and 50s, and how this relates, has defined also the principles of the attitudes towards this work. I believe that it is important to say that we were formed in an ideology that focused on civic questions for normal citizens, not just the wealthy. We believed and still believe in equality and egalitarian values. That's where our name Orbanus comes from, and our interest in public space, communal life in the street and the city as such. The three of us grew up as normal citizens, without any relationship to the top level of society. I think that this underlies why and how we care about the city. It is not about creating iconic buildings or signature architecture, even though they do a lot of that. Have a look at the book or on their website. So I included this because I like the, kind of the simplicity of this statement that maybe sometimes we forget. And also what this would mean in comparison to somebody who has been growing up, not in a communist country, as was the case when, Wang Hui, this is Wang Hui, and Luke Xiaodu grew up in China. But, those who grew up in the US or in Europe, what does it mean to our relationship to the top level of society and our relationship to society in general? I think it's also an invitation maybe to understand, better our guests from China who chose to come to Miami and to study at this university. What attitude do they have today, not being in their mid-50s, but in their mid-20s or even younger? The other point here is, we talk a lot about urban design. We rarely actually take the time to define it. So I was quite intrigued to have this discussion and to also benefit from the brilliance of these architects who who studied at Tsinghua University in Beijing, which is extremely difficult to enter, and who just have the work capacity and the intellect to analyze on a very high level. What we found out in terms of urban design is that this new discipline came from the States simply because they had an issue. It had become obvious that the street and the city in general had lost many of their former qualities, but the symptoms were different from Europe, despite the similar cultural background. Later, people realized that it had something to do with the fact that urban planning had been limited to the practice of zoning. Everything was conceived for cars. The roads were too wide and it was difficult to do somewhere on foot, to go somewhere on foot. The problem is that a lot of this has been exported to China. They followed a really bad example. This explains my ambivalent feelings with regard to the urban design terminology, just using the word, because there are other words. The word urban design is actually not that old and has, I think, been coined during a conference at Harvard. Urban design, in the American understanding, is an attempt to solve the problems that were artificially created, and this often in a piecemeal manner. It proposes, for example, to create a special zoning for a specific place in order to provide the pedestrian qualities of a European city. It also proposes to visually plan the city as a nicer one. This thinking sits at the base of theories like Kevin Lynch's. And these theories are making the city lean towards architecture and space. Urban design really focuses on the visual perception, on how the profile of buildings form the cityscape and character through the skyline, the landmarks, the waterfront, and so on. You find out what the important elements of the city are, and then you elaborate them into something. It's a strategy, and it's a good one, but it has this visual inclination at the expense of other approaches. It's interesting to hear this coming from an architect. This is a sketch that I found in the Harvard archives done by Kevin Lynch. It's interesting to come from an architect because obviously it's a criticism as much as appreciation that often comes from other professions that are collaborating with trained architects and sometimes deploring that our attitude is maybe too much just focusing on the image. We're just looking at the artifact, sometimes maybe losing a little bit out of context, what the life of people has to do with these artifacts. So there would be so much more to say, and we discussed so many other things, but I wanted to make it short in order to give you an overview of a maximum of voices. So another choice. Liz? Okay, so that's a difficult one. It's obviously a colleague, the head of our urban design program, the former dean of the school, I think for 18 years it was. Somehow yesterday I had to think that's almost as long as Angela Merkel was Chancellor of Germany. So that's maybe an appropriate or not appropriate comparison. So obviously, there are not many people probably in the world who would be more competent in zoning questions than Professor Blader-Seiberg and her husband or other of my colleagues here. So it also became a very important element for the chapter in the book. So we called it a recent history of zoning and design course in the US. And try to make this link between the societal revelations that are disguised as administrative trivialities, or as they can be perceived. So really, whoever listens here, I think the understanding of zoning is of an incredible importance, not only for urban designers also, but for architects. I think it's really one, if not the main tool of how our life, our political life turns and takes on physical shape. Now, it wasn't appropriate for me to talk about that. I guess that Professor Blader-Seiberg often has the opportunity to do that herself. So I went back more to historic questions. I was interested how that actually got there. Professor Blader-Seiberg, I think, is from not Philadelphia, but from Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. She studied in the North at some Ivy League institutions, and then came somehow by chance to Miami through her husband, Andres Duani. So what were those impressions? How did this form, what they became? The suburban work started because we were in Miami. That's pretty much all there was here, suburbia. The housing, mostly California style, promoted by the builders' magazines, was a specialty of architects trying to be clever within the limited means for repetitive houses. Someone else was laying out the land plan. Many people don't know that, right? I mean, if we look at these developments. The work for the market was derided by the academic world, or at best ignored. We were critical, but increasingly saw it as an intellectual challenge. and a professional opportunity. We got involved in urban design when our classmates who stayed in the north were designing interiors. They had a very early career. Architectonica, and they were co-founders of Architectonica, Andres and Liz, produced 4 spiky model houses, and they did not sell at all. In the end, the project was scratched because it was culturally foreign to a place where most of the buildings were kitsch, Mediterranean or California style. We had a similar experience with our first design for a family residence in Coconut Grove, the Hibiscus House. Hibiscus House looked to Adolf Loos because we knew that the spec house market could not tolerate Corbusier modernism. So the problem was not that they were not necessarily interested in Corbusier or didn't appreciate his work, but they thought, for example, that for a place like Miami, Adolf Loos might be the better precedent. When I worked for Robert and Denise Vetturi, I had been involved in the design of an exhibition at the Renwick Museum in Washington that focused on the image and culture of suburban houses. It was quite patronizing and presented decorative elements such as fake shutters, a certain type of rugs, and paintings as a cultural commentary related to social class. Later in South Florida, we found ourselves in the middle of this discussion, but in real life with real projects. So I found that quite fascinating. We see here, this is one of the early projects of Charleston Place. So in this case, DPZ didn't yet have the opportunity to change the zoning code, but they were trying to get the best out of the existing zoning codes and trying to find loopholes. So you see here this kind of housing division surrounding Charleston Place with kind of no kind of architectural decision, not designed by architects, no kind of shared spaces, no differentiation of whatsoever. And we can see that all of this starts to take place, even though in a modest form, but in a clear format for one of these early projects. And you know, we mentioned Hibiscus House, so that's the one that was inspired by some of the work of Adolf Loos, and as mentioned, you know, would respond, you know, better to some of the market demands existing in Miami, rather than other examples from modernism. So I think it's very interesting to see that Liz wouldn't be who she is now, and DPZ wouldn't have done the work that they have done if they had not come to Miami. If they had stayed somewhere in the north, they would have done very, very different work. Another choice. Adrian Rös, who has built several projects here in Miami. The most famous is like the Soundscape Park in front of the Gary New World Symphony in Miami Beach. But he did also right next to the Surfside building that collapsed, the landscaping for the Renzo Piano condo. He was also a very early superstar, became famous with a project, Borneo Sporenburg, that some of you might still know. It was like a bomb during my own studies. I think he was 32 when he won, you know, the competition for the construction of a new district in Amsterdam. And he is still, you know, very active now. So in the interview, we came constantly back to the question of what he calls the squatter legacy and how this has led to a notion of urban diversity that we appreciate today, and that gives us the opportunity to get out to a purely economically driven copy and paste logic of doing urban design. So I chose here two different pieces. One is about mass culture, and the other one more specifically about the squatting heritage. When we started, we had the ambition, and they started at landscape architects. He's first and foremost a landscape architect. He does not have an architecture degree. He's one of the few in this selection who is not only an urban designer, but who does not have an architecture degree. When we started, we had the ambition to bring the tradition of landscape architecture, which was then a more horticultural one, harmony-driven and a little nostalgic, into the world of modern mass culture, irregularity, conflict, and acceleration. We clearly did not share the aims and prevailing paradigms of our then colleagues in landscape architecture. That was our position in the 80s, and we chose it in full awareness. So it was very much influenced by Thatcherism, Reaganism, and what kind of social issues this created. Now you will see this was, the early attitude, how they got into business. And, now he talks about the attitude towards this kind of mass culture today. Mass culture represents a major trauma because it ridicules authenticity and suffocates the emergence of new illusions. It manifests itself in some sort of endless repetition of tested solutions that are easy to sell, that can be advertised, and that are understood by the financial sector, the building industry, and the authorities. I'm against a blind and predictable replication of a certain type of urban vocabulary and the behavioral protocols that come with it. I'm not negating the qualities and usefulness of some of these spaces. That's very important, and I think this has something to do with precedent work for the students. We have to look back, for example, towards the 19th century city, to Paris. I do that very often, to some also of the qualities that we can see described in new urbanism. But we should never forget that our identities have changed. And somebody like Adrian Holz is constantly trying to find a way out of the copy and paste on this kind of vicious circle that produces always the same, and only because it might not financially crash, assumes that it's therefore actually successful. But this is not the same to be successful and to cater to the needs to people as not to crash financially. And I just took an image here from the Tempelhof airfield in Berlin that has, after the closure of the airport, been transformed into a space just open to the population. So I think these are the topics that he is interested in. This is not something that he designed or his team, but it's something that shows us that 19th century Paris might not give us this opportunity, to do whatever we wish in the city center. So we have to sometimes come up with new ideas and not just replicate. And the squatter issue has something to do with that. So we were talking about a way out. That is exactly where the squatting legacy comes into play, for lack of a better word. People forget about Manchester and Amsterdam, or the alternative cool urban edge conditions of Hamburg. There are hundreds of good examples of this mixed-use urbanity that provides for a fundamentally good urban life. There is allowance, anarchy, wealth and poverty, and diversity on an ethnic level. The squatter movement aimed for an inclusive society. We started our office in such squatting conditions, working in an abandoned dock building in Rotterdam that later became Hotel New York. When it became a cool place for events and festivals, we moved to the building next door. 10 years later, gentrification took over, and the lessons about diversity, inclusive society, and experiments were forgotten. I think that it would be missing the point to dismiss squatting as a rebel movement, as was often done in the political realm. They brought up a very credible concept for urbanism, which I think is the best one up till now. Make cities cool and inexpensive, with beautiful streetscapes and lush green, add urban farming and space for children, add some anarchy, some pop-up locations, and low rental spaces for artists and for young people exploring themselves. So, this is an image here of, this famous Hotel New York, which I didn't know they had started in Rotterdam. Obviously now it's again a posh hotel. This is also, there's a relationship here that is not apparent in the citation. He speaks a lot about the transformation of industrial landscapes into housing or other kinds of mixed use, and that this also has a relationship to the squatting culture, that it was not automatically would have been the case to actually keep these buildings and to reappropriate them, and therefore providing spaces that actually have never been thought about because they were produced for something else. This is, by the way, also a way of innovating. You take something that has been, produced for another use, and then you change its use. So in a way, there's something very complex going on, and something that Adrian is very interested in. Another thing, obviously, this has something to do, innovation, if it comes from squatting. I think we cannot just, take the completely bourgeois point of view and saying, well, other people have to do it, or what has to happen in the society for this kind of outroar to happen. And I had to think, obviously, without coming to any conclusion about what happened in this country some months ago. And in France, also when I was there for sabbatical, the Yellow Vest movement, today we don't really know what is the truth, just to put this somehow in perspective. This image I found, through Google search, but on Breitbart.com. So, you can use all kinds of arguments in any kind of direction. But I think this question about, how much can we take, how much do young people want to take, is one that I think our audience will have to mostly think about. Another one. Or somebody online? Can we hear them? You muted them? Or let's just, we don't have too much time to, whatever. Somebody. When you do, interesting choice. Probably from the idea here really was to talk, many of those interview partners are also teaching, the majority. Only a few are full-time professors, like when you do, but most of them are also, practitioners with large or relatively large practices. When you do, here is the exception. He is the former dean and still professor, but the former dean of the Tsinghua School of Architecture in Beijing. And what we discussed about, and if I found it original as a choice, was his kind of obsession with monumental architecture and triumphal arches. But this on all kinds of different scales. So he's also interested in the design of the iPhone and what this means for the notion of monumentality to a certain extent. So we were discussing changing notions of monumentality in urban design. Again, the citations that I used here, I think, are probably inspiring and frustrating for some of us, because it explains how he is able to work as a full-time professor, very heavily engaged in research and publication, and still being able to actually build. I need this type of work, the competition work and the design work. It makes me happy also to balance my research and teaching activity. The point is that I can do it because I'm a professor. I'm totally free, and I use this freedom. If I had to run a professional firm, I would have to constantly look for new projects, more money. The competition itself is not important. For the competitions, approximately 6 per year, I organize a group of master and PhD students. This is done outside of the studio assignments, theirs and mine. It is not a workload with targets. It's entirely relaxing for me. I hope it's also for the students, I'm not sure. If the project is chosen, I collaborate with design institutes that can provide all the necessary competences and manpower, so that I do not have to start a design firm of my own. For the 2 university campuses I worked with, Tsinghua University Design Institute and a local design institute in Guangdong. This really has a tradition in China. I think this has something to do, obviously, with the fact that it was previously a communist country, officially still is, but I think things work a bit differently. But some of the design institutes still work in a different way of, a just normal private practice. And there is this link to academia. The reality is that the construction overview of a large project is difficult to combine with an intense academic activity. This is why the actual implementation of my design ideas is not the major concern. I prefer to keep my intellectual freedom and to choose what topics I address. My current interest in outer space would be difficult to elaborate in the context of a professional practice. So he's also doing more, down-to-earth things, but this is one of the proposals for kind of a conceptual design idea. But what is, I think has this kind of frustrating element for many of us, is that a professor at the university full-time would consider this as some kind of a parallel activity. So this is one of the designs, a full campus, except I guess of the organic piece here in the middle, that has been designed and built by Wenyi Zhu in collaboration with the Design Institute. And we can see here I think it's over 1 million square feet of building. And this is, parts of the central building here, the central library. So I found that somehow inspiring to see how could university maybe take on some of those ideas and to combine a private and professional activity. I guess we would consider this to be some kind of a conflict of interest, but maybe there's another way of approaching it. Another choice. Please. Paola Vigano, probably the most research active of all the people being interviewed, maybe with Wenyi Zhu. She is Italian. She has her office in Milan, and I think also a small one in Brussels. And she teaches full-time at the EPFL in Lausanne. I think she is also still hired at the University of Venice, where she was before. So I don't know when Paola is able to sleep. So we spoke a lot about the power of urban design as a research tool. And we called it a concrete description of future situations, a title that I somehow particularly appreciate. And it was also a little bit to bring it in context about talking about new technologies and the new technologies that we have available in order to do our work. So she uses all those technologies, but I think she also tries to make the point that the kind of traditional design work, together with GIS and other ways of doing which are more contemporary, can still answer or many questions or raise questions that can be taken on in a kind of multidisciplinary environment. So the choice that I made here had to do with research questions, but even before to do that, I think we have here a citation which quite clearly addresses points mentioned by Adrian Höls and Winnie Ma. So we start now, maybe a little bit late, in the presentation, to identify real connections between the interviews, that I was able to hold. Over the last few years, I realized that the ecological and social crisis of the 70s has never been totally digested. All the issues have bounced back. The social questions are still there, but instead of coming back in the form of May 68 or in the form of the German and Italian terrorism of the 70s, it comes in the form of populism, as we see now in the US, but also in several European countries. In the 70s, there was a lot of talk about the citizens and their participation. This statement, by the way, came through my point being made that somehow through internet, through mobile devices, through our contemporary society, we might be able to address the citizen needs much better than before. I was somehow suggesting that previously everything maybe looked democratic, but then was often very much master planned and dealt with in a more authoritarian way. So I think she doesn't fully agree with this. In the 70s, there was a lot of talk about the citizens and their participation. This is when the tradition of advocacy planning came in. Projects by Giancarlo De Carlo, for example, were fully based on the idea of a close relationship with the citizens and end users. Real participation, not just communication. One cannot say that in the past there has been a stronger hierarchy among the institutions, the experts, and the wider public, and many interesting experiences were directed. Then there was a moment of closure in the 80s and parts of the 90s. By the way, I think this point is important. I realized that this was when I grew up, and this might be an issue sometimes. Why the current generation has sometimes also an issue to get into this kind of topics. Maybe somebody who is older or younger has an easier connection to some of those social questions. Today, we are in a difficult, chaotic, and often populistic situation. Things are not clear because politicians often are unable to carry a project. And on the other hand, you have a great presence of citizens organized in movements with risks of instrumentalization of both experts and citizens. So I think it's a really interesting point that everything that we talk about now is really not new. So maybe what we should try to prevent that we are again closing down and not finding the answers. So Paula really has far more to say, but I will continue here talking about the research itself. Not all situations lend themselves to innovation. This again is a reaction to the discussion about technology, and what it can bring us in terms of progress. That's why I come back to my position towards urbanism as a tool of research. I find the current situation very difficult to decrypt, and therefore believe that it is maybe the right moment to introduce and insist on this notion of urbanism as a research tool, something that is there, but also has to take a critical distance. The freedom of research, that is what I'm interested in. The fact that there is, in urban design research, rarely an easy solution is not specific to urbanism. I think the point is, why are we not so taken extremely seriously? If you ask, for example, a physician, if their research will succeed, if they will find the solution, they will look at you in surprise. They are not concerned by this. Research does not always arrive at a solution, and it does not need the solution to be legitimate. This does not mean that one does whatever. It's a fine line. But I think what she said about the hard sciences, I remember recently having listened to some podcast where even the hard sciences are claiming that we are going more and more into money, just going towards projects which essentially already have the solution ready, rather than this kind of research which might open up further. My idea is that the marginalization of our work can be discussed starting from a deeper reflection on the capacity of the project to produce original knowledge. That's an important word, original knowledge, something new, on space, on cities, on territory of the present and of the future. I think that's how you have to see your projects. What can we see, what can we analyze through what you are showing to us? It's not rocket science. There is a large quantity of issues today in which space is not neutral and does not play a marginal role. But for these investigations to take place, one has to make clear that they are necessary and that they have to be debated. The products of the investigation have to participate in a wider debate. They have to go beyond our reports. That's this other point. There is no logic of innovation just going in one direction. There has to be debate, otherwise we don't go very far. This is a project among many others presented in the book. It's a study for a Euro region, I think between Belgium, France and the Netherlands. And the idea was actually to use the tools of the urban designer, somebody who can draw, who can bring information together in order to see how the water network, which does not have any kind of national boundaries, and frontiers, can actually contribute to redefine the relationships between different countries in this border region. So she analyzes, and this study is an in-depth study with a lot of metrics, how the above ground and underground watersheds, lead to an interdependency between those different regions, and maybe can strengthen the national cohesion for a unified Europe. I guess we have to for me to stop here. I knew I wouldn't finish all the 12 voices, but anyhow, it was a pleasure.
It was great, Eric. Very good. Amazing. Thank you very much. And we'll see you again at the Technoclass lecture series, at the Currents, and at the next Lunchtime lecture series in the spring. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.